economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. If you do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
What it is and how it works.
Welcome back to another episode of Because It Matters. I'm your host, Digital Debbie. Happy Black History Month, everybody. And this month we will be talking about the neglected topics of our beautiful history. Today's topic, we will be talking about the American Aborigines. There were tribes that were already here. And unfortunately, most people still believe that all blacks came from the ships from Africa. So let's talk about some of those statistics. According to PBS.org, only 12.5 million Africans were kidnapped from Africa, but only 10.7 million actually survived. And of that 10.7 million, 388,000 came to North America, and the rest were distributed to South America and the Caribbean. But the first people that were here were the American Aborigines. According to Indigenous and Americans.com, the American Aborigines owned 1 million square miles worth of land in the Louisiana Territory, southeastern region of Florida, and the colony of California. In many areas of America, black nations existed way before Christopher Columbus even arrived. Those lands were rightfully the American Aborigines before they were stolen and given to the white settler. The American Aborigines that were stripped from their land were dumped in Oklahoma. And one of the most historic and sad tragedies was called the Trail of Tears. 40 to 90 Indians were placed there. The point is that the American Aborigines were here, and they were here first.
If you don't understand white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you.
Now to our final conversation marking Native American Heritage Month. Throughout the month, we've had a series of conversations about how this continent's first people are living and making their mark on this country. We've talked about Native American veterans. We've heard about how the musical group Blackfire draws on both American punk rock and their tribal heritage to create a unique sound. We've also heard from a filmmaker who relayed the sometimes difficult story of how 5 members of the Crow tribe became part of his family. And we heard from the leaders of the other Congress, the National Congress of American Indians. If you missed any of those conversations, by the way, you can find them on our website. Just go to the Tell Me More Programs page at npr.org. Today, this final day in November, we decided to take a look at one group's shared heritage with Native Americans and efforts to have that heritage more broadly recognized. I'm talking about so-called Black Indians, people who are considered Black or African American, but who also claim American Indian heritage. For decades, that shared history has sometimes been celebrated, but sometimes the opposite is true. Joining us to talk about that, William Loren Katz. He's the author of the book Black Indians, A Hidden Heritage, and he's with us from our bureau in New York. Also with us is Shonda Buchanan. She's a descendant of North Carolina and Mississippi Choctaw Indians, and she's a professor of English at Hampton University in Virginia, and she's with us from the studios on campus. Thank you both so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Katz, will you start with us and just tell us how the relationship between African Americans and Native Americans began?
Well, it began with the earliest colonial period. Soon after Columbus arrived, Africans were brought in. And so you have a pattern of Native Americans taking in African Americans and the two people mixing and forming a kind of united front against the forces that were bringing slavery and colonialism to the Americas. So this has a long, long history. Is
this a history that is generally acknowledged by the tribes?
Well, I think some of them do, certainly along the East Coast where the African American members are prominent. And they played a very central role among the Seminole Nation. The Africans were among the leaders of it and took part in the 42-year war the Seminoles waged against the United States government and the slave catchers.
And forgive me, Mr. Katz, is it also true, though, that there were tribes who owned slaves?
Absolutely true, including the 5 so-called civilized nations. But I have to explain, it wasn't the kind of slavery that we associate with the plantations of the South. And people could get married, they could eat at the same table, people could get free, and they were treated nicely. And we know this from the testimony. They would much rather have had Native Americans to be their masters than the white slave owners of the South.
Well, that's a tough call, isn't it, who you'd want to own you. But be that as it may, Shonda, you wrote a piece for Indian Country Today about your experience of being a Black Indian at a Chickahominy powwow. Tell us a little bit about it. It was not a good experience.
Well, what happened to me was I was basically dressed in my buckskin and regalia, and I danced in the circle the first time, and one of the Chickahominy council members came to me, and he said, "Do you have your tribal enrollment card?" And I said, "No, do you card here?" And I actually had heard that the Chickahominy did card. So I said, "Okay, I won't dance." And I asked my husband, "Do you want to leave?" He said no. When I heard the announcer call for intertribals, generally at all the powwows, intertribals, anyone who is dressed in regalia can go ahead and go dance in the circle. And so I said, all right, well, it's intertribals. I'll go ahead and dance. I'm not disrespecting the tribe by dancing intertribals since I share this history. And when I came out of the circle after dancing intertribals, I was accosted by 3 of the council members who said to me, "Didn't you hear what we said the first time?"
But you didn't notice them asking anybody else for a tribal card?
No, they did not ask.
And so what do you think that meant? What is that? What did that mean? I assume that you were the only person who was visibly Black. Let's put it that way.
I was the only one who was visibly Black in that circle. And even though this is one of their rules, they cannot negate my heritage and my history, my oral tradition.
Well, was this an isolated incident, or is this something that happens to you or to others who are visibly Black with some frequency?
It does happen with frequency. Last year, we also went to the Chickahominy powwow, and one of the council members asked another one of our friends who, we call ourselves Red Blacks, another Red Black, if he had his card and if my husband had his card. And my husband was so upset, he said, "I'll never dance at that powwow again." So yes, it does happen with a frequency, and it seems that darker skinned people get carded, whereas the lighter skin or visibly Indian folks do not.
But Shonda, I think some people want to ask, why do you keep at it if people keep dissing you?
It's who I am. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like, I'm going to sit at that counter. I'm going to drink out of that water fountain. This is a heritage that my people have. And I wasn't raised on a reservation, but I was raised knowing I was Black and Indian.
Mr. Katz, what about you? What do you make of this?
Well, let me come at it from another way. A very sad thing has happened. This has nothing to do with dancing. This is worse. But the Seminole Nation has tried to remove members who are of mixed African and Native American descent. And this has happened with the Cherokees also. There's been a kind of rift. So what it seems that the initial lack of racism that led to this amalgamation has now gradually morphed into the acceptance of the kind of racism that was so prevalent in the white societies that nurtured it with slavery.
If you're just joining us, this is Tell Me More from NPR News. We're speaking with historian and author William Loren Katz, as well as Shonda Buchanan, an English professor at Hampton University, who's also of North Carolina and Mississippi Choctaw descent. And we're talking about the shared heritage, sometimes disputed, between people of African descent who are also claim Indian heritage. So Mr. Katz, what is that about? I mean, there are those who would say really what this is about is these tribes trying to narrow the pool of people who are eligible for tribal benefits. Do you think it's that, or do you think it's something else?
Well, I think it can be that. And also, remember, the U.S. government has always set the rules, which is kind of odd because it was the first, oppressor in the United States of both peoples. And the people suffering under it have a right to declare who they are and what they are, and they know their history.
And Mr. Katz, is there a similar effort to disenroll Indians who are white-looking?
No.
Absolutely not.
I think that's the proof of the pudding.
Where does this conversation go from here? I do want to note that last year, the National Museum of the American Indian had an exhibition about the relationship between African Americans and Native Americans. It was called Indivisible, and as I understand it, it was quite well received. That's one data point, and then the other data points are the experiences that you are having. Ms. Buchanan, where do you think, and I'll ask each of you to answer this as your final question, where do you think this conversation goes from here?
I think that exhibit at the Smithsonian was one beautiful small step towards recognizing the shared heritage of African and Native Americans. And the next step would be for tribal councils to actually have these kinds of conversations and to say, are we denying our brothers and sisters and cousins the journey that they took with us on that great walk? When the Cherokee were removed from the North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama area, their slaves were on the Great Walk or the Trail of Tears with them.
And Mr. Katz, what do you think? Final thought from you. Where do you think this conversation goes from here?
Well, I think that's a very good idea that there should be a conversation, because this is a wonderful heritage. This is something to be proud of, not to turn on in this post-civil rights era and raise issues that are really from the civil rights era.
William Loren Katz is the author of Black Indians, A Hidden Heritage. Shonda Buchanan, who has North Carolina and Mississippi Choctaw ancestry, is a professor of English at Hampton University in Virginia. Thank you both so much for speaking with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you don't understand white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you.
The reality is that Indians have been in uniform in our country since its formation. Now, the Civil War is a real serious issue because the reality is that the South, most of the main tribes were located in the South. The so-called civilized tribes, the Choctaws, the Cherokees, the Creeks. And as you may be aware, Indians also had slavery. And they had slavery before blacks were brought into the Americas. I mean, they captured people and they took them into the communities and they became into the community. But see, with the blacks and Indians, the slavery was kind of colorblind, because you were a slave in a sense, but you could be married into the tribe. You could be equal in a lot of ways, except that you didn't have the same freedom. You couldn't go home for dinner like you used to. Like, Osceola, the chief of the Seminoles, his mother was black. So you had that kind of situation. So blacks had a different kind of status when they were slaves of Indians, as opposed to the non-Indian community in the South. So anyhow, when the war broke out, it was almost logical that the Indians would protect their homeland, and the Confederacy very much wanted Indian allegiance, and what they promised the Indians was that when they won the Civil War, the Indians would then be able to be in their parliament, in their Congress, as equal members. Now that's something unheard of for Indians in the North. I mean, Indians were just always the bottom of the totem pole. And so that was a real carrot that was held out to Indian communities, that you'll be equal to us once we defeat the North. And so what you had then were thousands and thousands of Indians in uniform fighting for the Confederacy. And in fact, there were a couple of battles, like Pea Ridge, Arkansas. There were huge numbers of soldiers on both sides, but they were Indians. But they were in blue uniforms and in gray uniforms. But even going back, let's say, to the War of 1812, we all know about Andrew Jackson's, defeating the British in New Orleans. What we don't get told in the textbooks is that he had like 500 Indians in uniform with him. They were Choctaws. The last Confederate general to surrender was Stan Watee, a Cherokee. What, again, people don't even realize, the highest ranking Indian in the Civil War was Eli Parker. He was Grant's secretary. He ended up becoming, after the war, the first Indian to run the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, it was Parker who wrote the surrender documents because he had the best handwriting. And the other officers with Grant said, yeah, he had the best handwriting. But anyhow, everyone knew that he was a Seneca Indian. And when Lee walked into the room, he saw Parker and he said, I'm so glad a real American is here. And Parker says to him, sir, we are all Americans here. But I mean, this is the kind of dignity and class that Indians have provided in the military.
The point is that the American Aborigines were here, and they were here first.
When you've been looking into the history of the Tutelo people, bringing that back, I have to say, my areas in Chesapeake, and I had been following Piscataway and Conoy up into Pennsylvania through the colonial period, and hearing about Tutelo, and just like many other of the people that are looking at this, thinking, well, Tutelo has disappeared, has vanished. And then I heard about the work that you had done to bring the people back together, and I'm wondering about how you started that trail, and if you saw race playing into the submergence of Tutelo people over time as well.
Okay, as a native of the eastern part of the United States, you know about the Big Erasure. We call it Big Eraser. And that Native people, after the Removal Act, 1830, it was just assumed there are no more Indian people east of the Mississippi. So we don't have to provide a category for them. And so they were subsumed in this category of free people of color. And what's interesting, you can chronologize certain individuals, not away on a reservation, for instance. As long as they were on the reservation, they were Indian. As soon as they left in the reservation, for whatever reason, they became free people of color. Then finally they became African Americans, same people. And you could see it in the lifetime of a single individual. This journey, it changes in classification. Now, with regards to the Tutelo people, a fascinating study. The best place to begin is in your own family history. And so I started as a favor to my mother. My mother was very interested in knowing her background. And we had traditions in our family of Indian heritage. But we kind of had to keep it hush-hush because it wasn't very popular, and people would, oh, you're just making this up, and all this kind of craziness. But I got information from my elders, in 1977 to be exact, and they clarified and gave me places to look. And when I went to those places, I found what I was looking for. For instance, that in my mother's case, where she came from, was one of the places where one of the disbanded bands, if I can use the word disbanded bands, of Saponi people had settled around Henderson in what is now Vance County, North Carolina. And they settled on the property of a man named William Eaton, who had been their commander during the French and Indian War. And they stayed there. And they lived in an interesting place called Nutbush Creek. Everybody's heard of the Tina Turner connection. Well, Tina is a bullock, and we're bullocks from Nutbush Creek in North Carolina.
Okay.
So there's a suggestion that her folks, in fact, one of her ancestors appears in our family genealogy but fell off. So could he have gone, and they've named Nutbush after the community that they lost. But we established that there was a Saponi origin there. Then I met Rick Haythcock. His wife had done some great genealogical stuff. And they told me the story of the migration of some of the Saponi people to a place called Shamokin, which is now Sunbury, Pennsylvania. Now, one of the first things we had to deal with was the names. See, the same people may have different names in different locality. And at this time, at an earlier time, in Virginia, North Carolina, a bunch of Siouan-speaking people were called the Saponi Nation when they were placed on a reservation called Fort Christana. Now, when they came north to Shamokin and adopted in 1753 by the Cayuga, they went by the Iroquois designation of Tutelo. Now, we don't know what Tutelo means. I've been trying to track down the origins of Tutelo. Kathy points out that it has a similar sound to Tupelo. So in the Tupelo tree, so there may be some kind of connection. It's something that we're trying to decipher. But the Iroquois called all the Siouan people, including the Catawba, as Tutelo. And so that's the name that we acquired when we moved up into New York State. Now, what we were lucky is that the town of Ithaca had some archaeologists, and they discovered some artifacts. They did some shovel excavation and found where the main Tutelo village might have been in the south of Ithaca at the Cayuga Lake Inlet. Now, when Sullivan's army came through in 1779, they destroyed everything. And the people then reconvened, reassembled at Fort Niagara. And then they fought in the American Revolution with the Cayuga, because we're always grateful to the Cayuga for taking our people in. We were like the prodigal son that we were taken in, so we had this debt of gratitude to Cayuga people. I was able to present this belt to the Six Nations in Canada and to offer our thanks for what they had done for our ancestors. Now, at the end of the American Revolutionary War, a bulk of the people went into Six Nations Reserve and settled there. Now, I looked at the other migration of those who stayed in place in Virginia and in the Carolinas. And currently I'm tracing those that went down into the Creek, Choctaw, and Seminole Nation. So it's an ongoing study of the migrations of how people moved and how they tried to survive in any conditions that they could. So that's briefly what we've been trying to establish with the Tutelo reconnection. And the reconnection has been very interesting because some people didn't know it on either side and find that you have relatives that you didn't even know about. So, so that's pretty nice.
Right. You were talking before about manifest destiny, and that really links into the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, and how I think especially, a lot of times people wonder about the Indivisible Project, and it's sometimes of more interest to African American community people, where they have this story of the history in their lineage about their Native American history. With Native Americans, it seems sometimes to be more complicated or more worrisome, but at the same time, it's really about, and this is what my thinking was that we have to understand that by racializing Native peoples, it was an instrument for losing our lands.
Exactly.
That you see that is something that we don't really see in history. It's not really talked about, but it's this huge process, especially on the Atlantic seaboard, of how people have lost their land, their tribal status when they get racialized. And that is something that I think makes it very important for Native communities to get to start to deal with this kind of history.
Yeah, let me begin with the racialization. What we mean by racialization is, and you've probably heard this, are you a full-blood? That's the only group that ever gets asked that question, are you a full-blood? What does that mean? It means nothing, okay? This is part of how this system structured itself on the perception of race, so it could therefore stratify and exclude rather than include people. And then it works in insidious ways. Let me give you an example. Starting with Thomas Jefferson and his notes on Virginia. And when he begins to talk about the Virginia tribes, he maligns them. He says, oh, they're so mixed now, they show more Negro than Indian, there's hardly any Indian left. This was an excuse now to drive them off the reservations, because according to Jefferson, they're no longer Indian enough to hold on to the land. So you have a double whammy here. You have the one-drop rule. Now the one-drop rule is interesting. If I give you a cup of hot milk and pour in 1 drop of coffee, have you got coffee or do you still have milk? But now clearly you understand that when we talk about coffee, but why does it apply to human beings? But it was a convenient way of creating a caste system to rule people out of contention. So therefore, if you have 1 drop, you're all black. If you have 1 black in tribe, you're black by association. And that's a very convenient way of moving people off the reservation. So in defense, the Gingaskins and Delmarva, the Nottaways, who I mentioned before, they were more mixed than some of the other tribes, and they lost their reservation as a result. The Pamunkey and Mattaponi were able quickly enough to kind of distance themselves, to go through their ethnic cleansing, and were able to hold on to their lands today. So part of it was a defensive mechanism in order to hold on to the land. But then it's applied against even the tribes, especially if you go out in Oklahoma, and they make a distinction. Well, if you have a certain percentage of white ancestry, you're considered competent. If you don't, you're incompetent. And then the idea of having you to do your constitution so that you define yourself out of existence. We're talking earlier about a lecture I heard by an Osage lawyer. They had the Osage and the Claud were the only 2 tribes that kept reservations when Oklahoma became a state. When Oklahoma became a state, Oklahoma is a fascinating place in terms of contradictions. All the other tribes were abolished. Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, all of them were abolished. They had business councils, but they didn't have any tribal structure. But they had set, the Osage had set their requirements of blood quantum so high that when they realized they were running out of members and they wanted to call back a committee to revise their constitution, they couldn't get a quorum, because they had defined themselves out of existence. So this is how this works. Now, usually how dissent works is that it comes down without reference to race. Now, if I'm a Shinnecock sitting out there in Long Island, like my wife has in her ancestry, goes back unbroken. Okay? Now, the fact that some racial lines may have been crossed, that doesn't change her blood relationship to those ancestors. But the way racism comes in and says, well, if you're black, you have no right to ancestry. And so what we're beginning to do now is to challenge that and saying, no, the rule is the line of descent, the line of heritage. And if one can show that, then why should one be excluded because of race? And the B.A.R, the Bureau of Acknowledgement and Research, they'd say that in one breath, race is not a factor in acknowledging or recognizing tribes, but yet it is, because they use that against. And as we sit here and I'm thinking about the Shinnecocks after many, many years, their records go back to the Dutch, unbroken, and the difficulty that they had. And can you tell me it's not because of race? And I think because Obama is in the White House must have helped them quite a bit, because people would have been kind of embarrassed to kind of raise the racial issue in an Obama White House. If someone else had been in the White House, it would have been sweep it under the carpet kind of thing. So race plays into all these considerations, and the groups in the South, the Hauma, the Moa, Choctaw, they all have all these difficulties because how they were classified earlier. Now, if anybody's doing any research here, I know Ruth Hunt is here, and we've talked about this. The first thing I was told in doing this research is disregard racial designation. Disregard them, because they are not reliable. Okay? Jack Forbes is certainly, if you go to Jack Forbes, he'll tell you a lot of the tricks that they play. Now, for instance, if an enumerator goes out and returns people as Indians or returns people as Negroes, see, he's paid based on the people that he returned in his report, his enumeration. He was paid a higher amount for recording Negroes than he was for Indians. So where's his bias? He's trying to maximize the money he gets. He's going to make as many people as Negro as possible. And so Jack Forbes was fond of saying, they're always losing Indians, but finding Negroes. And this is how this insidiousness. So when you look for your ancestors in your census, I look for three things. The surnames, because we were lucky that people adopted European surnames very early, 1700s. Look at the surnames. Look how they cluster. Look at the time and look at the place. And you can backstop this with some of the studies that was done by Gilbert and some other people with the Smithsonian that identify these communities, identify these names in these communities, and there you have a way of designating. Also, you can turn their arms against them. I'm reminded of this book by Gloria Bird and Susan Harjo in Reinventing the Enemy's Language. And there's this terrible man, Plecker. You remember Plecker, don't you? Well, Plecker was so adamant. He was part of the eugenics movement. He had relationships with Nazi Germany, and he was not a very savory character. And he personally changed the designation of people themselves. If it had Indian, he made it C for color. Okay. Then he listed county by county the people who would be trying to pass as Indians. That's a blueprint, see, because like Shakespeare said, the lady doth protest too much. So you can take his own list, and if your family is included in that list, you can be relatively sure that they were Indian.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Walter Plecker was the head of the Bureau of Vital Statistics in Virginia, who passed the Racial Integrity Act, and so it was actually outlawed to designate yourself as an Indian, or for midwives or any official record keepers in Virginia, it was prohibited to identify oneself as an American Indian in Virginia from 1924 until 1967, when Loving versus Virginia overturned the anti-miscegenation laws. So this, has huge impact, and maybe we're just at the point where we have a generation that's been born after that era to be able to sit back and reflect on it. There's a term that you've used.
If you don't understand white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you.
But first, we want to talk about one of the many complicated stories that involve race and heritage. While it is well-known history that slavery was a common practice in the Deep South before the Civil War, less well-known is the fact that it wasn't just white families that were slave owners. Some well-to-do Native Americans also owned slaves. In fact, the late Cherokee Nation Principle Chief Wilma Mankiller wrote in her autobiography that, quote, "The truth is that the practice of slavery will forever cast a shadow on the great Cherokee Nation," unquote. Indeed, that shadow continues today in the latest iteration over the debate over just who to include as members of the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Supreme Court has stripped some of the slave descendants, known as freedmen, of their Cherokee citizenship in a decision last month. We wanted to learn more about this story and the interesting intersecting histories of African Americans and Native Americans, so we've called upon Tiya Miles. She is a professor and chair of the Afro-American and African Studies Department at the University of Michigan. She's also the author of several books on the subject of African American and Cherokee history, including The House on Diamond Hill, a Cherokee plantation story. And today it was also announced that Professor Miles is a 2011 MacArthur Fellow. That means she is the recipient of one of those coveted $500,000 Genius grants. And she's with us now from WUOM in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Professor Miles, congratulations. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm glad to be here.
And I do hope we get a chance to talk a little bit about the MacArthur in a minute. But I did want to talk about this story that's in the news. It's a very complicated history. Could you just set the stage for us about the moment in which these two cultures, African Americans and Cherokee Nation, intersected?
The point is that the American Aborigines were here, and they were here first.
Sure. Well, African Americans, actually Africans, and Native American people first met each other during the colonial era. So that would have been in the 1500s, when Africans were brought to the Americas as both slaves and indentured servants.
You don't understand white supremacy, what it is, and how it works. Everything else that you understand will only confuse you.
That relationship then took a number of twists and turns over time, and one of the most difficult periods was in the 1800s, the 19th century, when some Native Americans in the South began to own blacks as slaves.
So what is this dispute over who is included and who is not included? And why is this? I mean, this would seem to have been something that would have been settled long ago.
Well, I think that we can look at the situation in Native American nations that had owned slaves as being somewhat similar to the United States situation. The U.S. is a country that owns slaves, and although slaves were freed and received citizenship, that is an issue that is hardly settled. There are vestiges and legacies of racial division, segregation, racial hierarchy that Americans feel as a whole. And it's similar in Native American nations that have legacies of slaveholding. Those tensions still remain.
Well, as I understand it, the whole question of eligibility is determined using something called the Dawes Rolls. This is something that arose from the Dawes Commission, which was established in 1893, as I understand it, to convince what were called the 5 civilized tribes to agree to dissolve the reservation system, and that they wanted a list, the U.S. government wanted a list of all the members, and the so-called Dawes Rolls are considered, determinative of who is a member of the nation and who is not. But so what role do the Dawes Rolls play in this current dispute over whether the so-called Cherokee freedmen are members or not?
Well, the Dawes Rolls are central to this dispute. So in 1887, the Dawes Act was passed, and as you said, that led to an enrollment or the development of a census of Native American people. Because before land could be allotted, the U.S. government had to know who to give the land to. That list was a segregated list. It was a segregated census that divided people based upon their racial ancestry. So the Dawes Roll was organized by Cherokees by blood, intermarried whites, and also freedmen. And these lists were incomprehensive to begin with. A number of people who were descended from slaves owned by Cherokees didn't even get to make the list because they weren't there. They had fled during the Civil War, for example. Other people who had been on previous lists weren't allowed to be on the list because of the arbitrary way in which designations were made. One example of this, which I think is really telling and also disturbing, is that the Dawes enrollment group that came to make the list would set up tents in the Indian nations. And one tent was called the Indian tent. The other tent was called the Darky tent. And there was a second name for the Darky tent, which I will not mention on air, but I think that you can probably fill in that blank.
Was it the N-word? Did it involve the N-word?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
And so when Cherokee people, descendants of slaves, came to be enrolled, they were directed to one or the other tent. So the decision was made before they even had access to an interview and got to say who they were. The decision was made whether or not they should be written down on the list as a Cherokee person, quote, by blood, or as a freedman.
If you're just joining us, I'm Michelle Martin, and this is Tell Me More from NPR News. We're speaking with Tiya Miles. She's a professor of history and a 2011 MacArthur Fellow. It's just been announced. We're talking about the Cherokee freedmen. They're descendants of slaves which were owned by members of the Cherokee Nation. That tribe's Supreme Court has recently revoked the citizenship of the descendants of freedmen. So in this latest chapter in this historical saga, for now, some 2,800 freedmen have been stripped of their Cherokee citizenship, which means that they're no longer eligible to receive, whatever tribal benefits they had been receiving, and that their votes won't be counted in an upcoming tribal election. In response to that, the Bureau of Indian Affairs has frozen some payments to the Cherokee Nation until this matter is resolved. Why is this coming up now?
I think there could be a few reasons, and this is speculation on my part because I'm not in the Cherokee Nation. I'm not a member of that tribe. But I think that history suggests that when resources are at stake, there tends to be greater tension around the relationship between enrolled Cherokee people who define themselves as being Cherokee, quote, by blood, and the descendants of freed people.
You can imagine that this has gotten a lot of attention. It's highly controversial. It's heavily covered, as you might imagine, in the Indian media. And there are those who are saying that this is just racist. I mean, that this is an attempt to define nationhood by blood, brings up all kinds of nasty historical analogies. And there are a lot of people who are just shocked by that. Should they be?
Well, I think so. I'm shocked. But I think that it's frustrating. It's ironic. It's so difficult to confront the fact that this whole tangle around who should be Cherokee was really set in motion by the United States government, which had colonized Cherokee people and other indigenous people in this nation. So what the Cherokee Nation is doing now is relying on these Dawes Rolls, which were forced upon them by the U.S. government.
Okay,
and
but that was in the 19th century.
Well, I think
there are a lot of racial practices that occurred in the 19th century and before that people no longer embrace.
Well, I think that those legacies remain with us. And I think that in the case of the Cherokee Nation and other Native nations, there is a felt conflict between the sovereignty of those nations and the question of what the role should be, what the place should be of minorities in those nations. So whereas the United States can and has at times protected the status of minorities and not felt itself threatened by Canada, for instance, about what it does, Native nations definitely feel themselves threatened by the United States government. They are concerned that their sovereignty, the right to make decisions for themselves, is going to be undermined by the U.S. government, as it has been so many times in the past. But what I feel is a real problem here is that the Cherokee Nation is taking its definition from what really has been a white supremacist U.S. nation that sought to...
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask you how you got interested in this.
I got interested in this back in graduate school, and there were a few different experiences that led to my focus on it. One is that I come from an African-American family that has had an oral history of Native American ancestry. And my grandmother, when she talked about it, didn't have facts or names. She just had the story that kind of took on the shape of a myth in our family. It so happened that I ended up marrying into a Native American family myself, and then I had a whole other set of experiences around Black and Native American relationships. And then when I went to graduate school, I was taking a course in Native American history, and I was quite surprised to discover that, in fact, there had been quite a lot of conflict, tension, pain between Native Americans and African Americans. So I wanted to explore that, and I really set out to kind of prove my grandmother's story right. I mean, I wanted to find examples of African American and Native American resistance to racism and colonialism in the United States.
But what you found was the opposite.
I did. I found the opposite. I found a story that really had to do with the ways in which the pressures of colonialism and slavery came to bear on Native people as well as Black people, and sometimes led them to make really awful choices.
What it is and how it works.
Most people would be surprised to hear that Indians had slaves, but it's a fact.
They've been citizens of the tribe since the 1860s.
I consider myself to be a Cherokee, and that's what I am, and that's what I'll be till I die. Nobody can take that away from us.
We was all voted out and kicked out the same night.
Her question was, what can we do? My response was, let's sue them.
I honestly did not realize how powerful the Cherokee Nation's response was going to be.
The Cherokee Nation has spent a fortune on this case.
Indian gaming generates $30 billion a year in revenue. The black members of those tribes have been excluded from those benefits.
It is time for us to stand up as black freedmen. Enough is enough.
When I started off, I thought this would be a slam dunk, and it wasn't like that at all.
Let me say, Kahe, welcome.
We usually think of the tribes as the victims of injustice, which is true. But victims can do bad things too.
If you voted against the freedmen because their skin is darker than yours, their hair is curlier than yours, then you're a racist.
Tribal people should govern themselves. We don't need somebody from the outside telling you who should be in and who should be out.
When you know what you really are and you haven't been embraced or acknowledged, it's horrible.
We're not kicking them out because of their color. We're kicking them out because they don't have Cherokee blood, and that's the way it should be.
Is there a similar effort to disenroll Indians who are white-looking?
No.
We sit 30 miles from New York City. Why should it be so surprising that there's still Native American tribe here that's still intact?
Indians are not allowed to move through time like the rest of us. We don't run around in wigs. We don't wear frock coats anymore. But Indians are supposed to be in leather to be Indians.
You shouldn't be going out there and impersonating. I don't go out and impersonate other people. I am who I am, and that's what I live within.
Who is he to say who's Native and who's not? Anybody that tells you they are pure-blooded this or pure-blooded that is lying.
Prick your finger and see how many sources your blood comes from. Oh my God, I'm a Native American. Well, you know what? A lot of people are. A lot of white people don't want to admit how black some of them are.
They used to call me half-breed, nigger, you name it. I broke that hand a few times on people's chins.
It is about racism. It's about the native people of this country. It's about the Ramapos being treated like dirtbags, like these people have been doing for the last 200 or 300 years.
Some people look at it like you're trying to be something that you're not, but it's a feeling within inside. You know, you feel that this is who I am and this is what I want to do.
No matter what you think you are, the reality is when you look in the mirror, what you see is what the world is going to see, and that's how you're going to be defined. We are Ramapo Indians.
New on 2 News at 6 tonight, dozens are protesting in Muskogee. They're opposing the Cherokee Nation's Supreme Court ruling to not include the freedmen in the tribe. 2 News reporter Liz Bryant joins us now live with the very latest. Liz?
Ross, it has been an ongoing battle for freemen. This is the 3rd time they have been delisted as Cherokee citizens. Today, you can see they've been standing out here for hours with all their signs, but it's for one common goal, to fight for what they say is their heritage.
Our ancestors walked that trail.
Members of the freedmen have a message for the Cherokee Nation. Treat me right.
This unjust, illegal ruling
which deprives the freedmen of their citizenship rights.
Last week's Supreme Court ruling takes about 2,800 people off the Cherokee list of citizenship.
The freedmen were either freed slaves or children of freed slaves.
The group lived on Cherokee land in 1942 and were included in the Treaty of 1866, stating they have the same rights as native Cherokees.
So you have to be an Indian to be a member of an Indian tribe.
In 2006, a district court ruled the freedmen are tribe members. But then in 2007, a vote of the people stated members had to be one of the 41,000 listed on the original Dawes Rolls in order to obtain benefits.
There was no Dawes Rolls at the time of the treaty in order to divide lands. They were never made, and whether somebody was on the freedman roll or the by blood roll was not determinative of whether or not the person had Indian ancestry.
Freedmen members say the timing of the delisting is suspicious.
The freedmen don't vote. It may sway the election one way or another way.
They had that issue in front of them less than a month before in the challenge to the election suit. They could have kept Principal Chief Chad Smith in office if they had wanted to, if it was only a matter of politics.
And today, a request for an injunction was filed in federal district court. That hearing is set for September 20th. Now, Hammonds does add there are numerous jurisdiction hurdles to overcome before the case can be heard. Live in Muskogee, Liz Bryant, 2 News Works for you.
Is there a similar effort to disenroll Indians who are white-looking?
No.
Is this you discussing Indian blood? We're going to judge people by whether they have Indian blood, whether they're qualified to run a gaming casino or not?
That probably is me, absolutely. Because I'll tell you what, if you look at some of the reservations that you've approved, you, sir, in your great wisdom have approved, I will tell you right now, they don't look like Indians to me, and they don't look like the Indians. Now, maybe we say politically correct or not politically correct. They don't look like Indians to me, and they don't look like Indians to Indians, and a lot of people are laughing at it, and you're telling how tough it is, how rough it is to get approved. Well, you go up to Connecticut, and you look. Now, they don't look like Indians to me, sir.
Thank God that's not the test of whether or not people have rights in this country or not, whether or not they pass your look test.
Depends whether or not you're approving it, sir.
No, it's not a question whether I'm approving it. It's not a question whether I'm approving it. Mr. Trump, you know in the history of this country where we've heard this discussion before, they don't look Jewish to me.
Oh, really?
They don't look Indian to me. They don't look Italian to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a test for whether people could go into business or not go into business, whether they could get a bank loan. You're too black, you're not black enough.
I'm Derek Hankerson, and I'm with FirstCoast.tv. This morning, I'm with my cousin B, and we're at Flagler College for the Yamassee Conference. B, good morning. Can you explain to the non-natives what B stands for?
B in our language, which our language is the language of Hichiti. A lot of the Mikosuki people speak a form of it right now, but B means head chief, and me being head chief of the Yemassee Indian Nation.
Is the Yemassee Nation a federally recognized tribe?
Well, that's a twofold question, and sometimes people lack the understanding of federal recognition versus federal acknowledgement. Federal acknowledgement is what we do have, and federal acknowledgement comes from various forms: treaties, federal court orders, and or the process where you petition the Bureau of Indian Affairs to be actually recognized. Now, once you receive or you put forth a treaty and make sure that your tribe is a part of that treaty, and or you prove that you have a federal acknowledgement through court documentation, you can now use that in order to be federally recognized. We have federal acknowledgement through federal court documentation, and it's nothing that we put on record or publicized through online documentation and whatnot like that. But we do have federal acknowledgement through federal court system recognizing us as a legitimate tribe based on the standards of what a tribe is.
How do we distinguish between the Creeks and the Yamassees?
Well, that's a very complicated but simple question, and it was posed yesterday at the conference. What was the distinction? And what we found is that we know historically there was no difference. The Yemassee were renamed the Creeks. The Creeks did not exist until after the Yemassee War of 1715. If you get the book or you find yourself ever wanting to research a book, The Invention of the Creek Nation, identifies that inside of the documentation. It says that the name Creek was created for a political purpose, which would be basically land acquisition. So I think to try and piece this thing together, or the puzzle together for people, will create disruption of history. I think it would upset a lot of people, because you have a nation now called the Creek Nation that is federally recognized, and people were like, well, why aren't the Yemassee recognized if they are actually the Creeks?
Right.
And some of that supporting factor was the Yemassee was the only tribal nation here in the Southeast that had an upper and lower chiefdom or confederacy.
Right.
Well, there was no upper or lower Creeks before there was an upper or lower Yemassee.
Right.
And so, you know, without going into detail,
right,
because this is a very controversial topic.
Right.
Without going into detail, I would just employ the viewers to, you know, do their own research.
Exactly.
And find out for themselves.
And that's why it pays to tell the truth from the beginning. My last question is, why do academics assume all Yamassee have been extinct?
To be fair to the academics, I will not say that all academic scholars think the Yemassee were extinct, because if they did, we wouldn't have a conference today.
Good point.
This conference also outlined and entailed, through factual documentation and proof, through bloodlines, the continuation of Yemassee clan members and grandmothers, and everything that they've had and presented here, that we were never extinct. That's the purpose of the first ever Yemassee conference, which also correlates with the 300-year anniversary of the Yemassee War of 1715. The academic scholars that were centuries old, as we would like to say, let's go back in time, they had a unique purpose. They had a specific purpose to make the Yemassee extinct, because we had a land settlement. We had a land agreement. We had one of the first reservations in the United States. It behooved them to say that these people who have given us problems for over, you know, centuries now are dead. They're gone. It gives you right now to land, you know, gives you rights to the land. They needed to do that to disrupt the fabric of the Native American population, and also to encompass the land that they was trying to colonize. So after the Yemassee War, they had to have the Lord Proprietors feel comfortable about their investments,
right,
you know, coming from England and sending over their indentured
right,
servants, you know, servants
right,
to come here and then colonize the land.
Right.
It's sort of hard to say, I want you to invest in something in this new world, and you're saying, well, we have to worry about the savages.
Right.
What about those savages, you know, that just killed 400, you know, Charleston people, and killed, you know, massacred all of our people.
Right.
Well, you know, the best way to do that was to write us out. The Europeans have a saying that says, the pen is mightier than the sword.
That's correct.
And in this instant, it was.
Right.
Our people never had the need or want to write or read their documentation.
Right.
You know, we never cared about how they seen us.
Right.
Our whole purpose was for survival.
That's right.
You know, we cared about our children,
That's
our
right.
grandmothers, the same
families.
thing we are now.
Exactly.
And the whole writing this out was just that. But anyone that takes the time out, you know, without being ignorant,
right,
you actually take the time out and say, hey, you know, how did these people become extinct when you identifying them as Seminoles,
right,
or you identifying them as Miccosukee,
right,
or you identifying them as Yamassee Seminoles, or all the different names they give us? How is that an extinct race?
Right.
How do you say these people no longer exist when you say these other tribesmen married into their women and had babies by their women, when every tribe in the Southeast had a matrilineal society?
Right.
So that meant that if you had a baby from a woman and she was of the Yemassee, then that baby was Yemassee.
That's right.
And so they have these things documented on Seminole records.
Right.
They have these things documented amongst the Miccosukee.
Right.
They have it documented amongst the Creeks. So, you know, when you say that, you know, again, the extinction, people that have a purpose will look past that.
Right.
People who have a purpose will say, oh, well, they're all African, or they're, you know what I mean, they're African American.
Right.
Well, no, we're not. We happen to be dark-skinned people, and actually, we're not even black. We're
right.
red-skinned. We're red-skinned. We're
red-skinned.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? They say copper tone.
Exactly.
You know?
It's redskins.
It's redskins.
Right.
You know,
and hence the big debate with the Washington Redskins. Some look at it as being offensive. Some look at it as being derogatory. But what most people don't know is, prior to the British immigrating to Virginia and Washington, who were there? The Redskins.
The Redskins. And that's exactly right. You know, it is so pivotal that people really understand the literal meaning of things.
Exactly.
And what I mean by that is, when people see dark-skinned Indians, and if we're going to see some cousins, the Miccosukee.
Yes.
Today, we're going down to Miami to see Leroy Osceola,
yes,
the traditional Miccosukee.
Yes.
When you see their ancestors, which are our ancestors,
yes,
you look at us. You're looking at mirror images of us.
Right.
And so that is important, because when you see modern day Miccosukee who have bred out a little bit,
right,
or are bleeding out
right,
gradually,
right,
and they become lighter and lighter of skin.
Right.
Those with the truth will say, well, this is coming from the raping of our women,
right,
the raping of our children, and their skin tone gets lighter.
Right.
And I say that because, you know, it becomes so controversial when people see people of our skin tone
who are lighter or darker.
Who are darker.
Exactly.
And then they say, oh, they're Africans. That is like saying all of the lighter versions of Native Americans in the West are Mexicans.
Exactly.
They get called that.
Sure.
They get called that.
It's ignorance.
It is ignorance.
It's sheer ignorance.
It's pure ignorance
Right.
at its best.
Right.
And it's also a form of racism because it's a competition.
Right.
What is it that you don't want the
Right.
dark-skinned Indians to achieve?
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And you're perpetuating the same type of mentality or
Ignorance.
mental ignorance that your ancestors
Right.
were part to, that they had, subjected themselves through, and which what they were fighting about. You're doing the
Exactly.
same thing. And then we won't do, as Native Americans, we won't say, well, brother, you're lighter than myself, and science have proven you're Mongoloid. Your ancestry is a Mongoloid and that you come from Siberia.
Right.
We won't do that. So we don't have to play that game.
That's right.
What we do is we embrace all people, but we ask that you truly get an understanding of Native American history, Native American documentation. There is nothing that we wrote about us.
Right.
Go back to, if you believe in, the white man, then go back to his documentation and look at what he says, because it only seems that our people believe what he says.
Right.
So it's documented who we are. It's documented what we've done. It's documented where we were.
Right.
And when they couldn't no longer document us, they put census records
That's
on us.
right.
You know what I mean? They started
Right.
putting a census to find out where we
Where
were.
we were.
And
Where
then-
are you?
And then they wrote down Negro.
Right.
You know what I mean? But I asked everybody, where was a Negro on the continent? Name the country Negro.
There is no country. Actually, it was a Spanish term for black.
Plain and simple.
So we were in Spain.
Plain and simple. But you had a question, I apologize.
No, what I was going to say is my cameraman, Jorge Rivera, had two questions. And one question was, would you speak something in Yamassee? Would you say something in Yamassee for non-native speaking people?
Yeah. Ani miki siko halam hachutolame Yamassee hajo. Ani miki bi ayati Yemassee. Ani fusi eripaka hajo. Ska Miccosukee. Puni Yemassee onke. Shunabichi. To you, your cameraman, to the people. A rough translation is, I am Se'khu Hidden Eagle, Yemassee, of the chief Arapaka Hajo. Sam Jones is what he's known, and he lived in Miccosukee,
Yes.
Florida. Our people still exist,
Yes.
and we thank you for allowing us the opportunity to be able to speak and clarify some records.
Truthfully.
Truthfully, thank you.
And the second question that he has is, how do you think DNA testing has brought about, I hate using the word evolution, but I will, brought about the evolution of people actually knowing who they are and where they're from?
Yeah, I'm not there. It hasn't. DNA testing would say that somebody was back in the 1700s and they drew blood from a native, and now they have blood that they can compare it to. That's not true. What they say is DNA testing allows us to know that your ancestors have been on this portion of the continent for so long because of genetic markers, because of the plants that here, the air that you breathe, because of this particular part of the continent's environmental makeup, okay? So they can trace where your people were versus where they were not. But the problem becomes with that, they've traced markers with everyone that says at one point in time we're all linked into what they call a African woman called Lulu'amu. Every human being has the same genetic trait and makeup. Every human being can be traced back to one part of this world. And those are markers like the tree, our brothers and sisters, the trees. When you go inside of a tree, they have rings. And the rings
right.
can tell you
The
how
life.
long that
Exactly.
tree has lived
Right.
and what it has endured. They can literally tell you if that tree encompassed a storm and what damage it did to it.
Right.
You know, they can tell you if smokestacks was around it and it had, the carbon within the tree, absorbed so much smokestack. So they can say, oh, at this particular time, this tree was around a fire. They're doing that now with DNA. And what they found within DNA is there is no genetic marker or makeup that says that you're Indian. There is no genetic marker that says you're Native American. All they can say is your people have been here for so long, and that you have people that were here because of their genetic marker or their genetic makeup.
That makes sense. Well, thank you, cousin.
Thank you. Should I be checked?
Yeah.
The point is that the American Aborigines were here, and they were here first.
You are now listening to P.A.R. People Activity Radio, and I'm your host, JohnGHorse. Welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place. P.A.R. aims to be a family-friendly information distribution program seeking to inform non-white people, in particular black classifieds, and assist in counter-racist codification. The title of today's show is American Aboriginals, Racial Classification Confusion, and the Indigenous Heritage of Foundational Black Americans. Yes, indeed. And we are on another episode of People Activity Radio, attempting to remove confusion. And in this particular case, we are going to be addressing the big American elephant in the room by way of racial classification confusion. And I have concluded from my research that racial classification is designed to be confusing. And at the end of the day, if you are classified as black or non-white, you are supposed to be confused. The only ones that do the classifying, as Nearly Fuller Jr. says, is the people who classify themselves as white and believe in white supremacy and American Aboriginals, racial classification confusion, and the indigenous heritage of foundational black Americans is a big fat helping of confusion. Once you start to examine the documentation, and when we're examining documentation, you are examining documentation written. You are examining documentation endorsed. You are examining documentation certified by people who classify themselves as white and believe, self-proclaim themselves to be straight up and down racist white supremacists. And I am talking about the federal government of the United States. I'm going to say it one more time if I was not clear. And I am talking about the federal government of the United States. You understand me. Now, I played a series of clips to illuminate one fact: that we are under and we are subject to a global system of racism, white supremacy. If you did not know that, here on P.A.R. People Activity Radio, we speak, we analyze, we research, we produce a perspective under that context, under the context of global white domination, also known as global white supremacy. There's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to hide. Wherever you go on this here planet, you are going to be under the power structure dominated by people who classify themselves as white and believe in white supremacy. And under that context, we're going to examine who are these individuals that are classified as black. Or, as we politically are referred to, African Americans. Who are we? Well, if you let the white supremacists tell you, you're going to be dizzy, you're going to be chasing your tail, and you are going to be confused if you accept the white supremacists' story. Here on People Activity Radio, we have been consistent. We are extremely suspicious of any and everything that comes from out of the curriculum, that comes from out of the history books, that comes from anything that the suspected white supremacists have touched. I mean, the historical track record lets you know that deception, outright lying, misinformation is not above, below, beside the dominant society. Matter of fact, deception is a key tool used in their domination. That being said, who are African Americans? Well, if you look at the history books, they tell you, in the curriculum in school, they tell you that all you Negroes were brought over in slave ships for the purpose of involuntary free labor. Or, as we're told, you were slaves. Now, if you look at the term slave, the etymology of it comes from, I believe, a term that was directed toward Slavic people who were under the thumb of North African Muslims, and they were called Slavs, and then that word manifested into slaves. Now, when you hear the word slaves, nobody ever think of Slavic, Germanic, Russian people. The number one Slav was the Russian women that were thrown into the harems, or the Slavic women that were thrown into the harems, reproducing a buffer class of offspring that would later become the standing army well, for the lack of a better term, that served as a dedicated force to what we now know as the system of racism and white supremacy. You can find this in the book written by Chandler. My gosh, I always forget the brother's name, but it's called The Deconstructing of African Civilization, and I believe the elder's name was Dr. Chandler Williams. I could be in error, but I know Chandler's in there. Chancellor Williams, but I could be in error. Don't quote me, but I do know the title, The Destruction of Black Civilization. He says that the mixed race offspring were a dedicated army for the so-called Asiatic commandeering of what was then Black North Africa or Black Asia. But I digress. I got to get back to the Americas. But when you're dealing with these people who are called African American, what you're dealing with is a story. You're dealing with a myth. You're dealing with a fairy tale. Because once you start to look at the documents and the evidence that has been written by the white supremacists, they weren't smart enough to remove the information that tells you who African Americans is. Now, am I saying that there were not West Africans brought from the continent of Africa to the Americas? No, I'm not saying that. We know from the evidence and the meticulous records kept by the white supremacists, the dominant society, the conquistadors and the explorers of Europe, France, and the explorers of Spain, and the explorers of Portugal, and the explorers of the Dutch Empire, and the explorers of Britain, that a lot, in the case of the Africans, most of them were brought to the Caribbean and then to Central and South America. But when you're dealing with what we are calling North America or the United States or the colonies, very few of the millions of Africans that were allegedly brought from the continent of Africa came to North America. Well, then that would raise the question would be, well, who are the people who are classified as Negro or described as Negro and originally described as Indian, and then they become described as Negro, and then they become described as free people of color, and then they become described as black, and then they become described as African Americans, or just referred to as slaves. Well, we have documentation that Native Americans were indeed captured and forced to work on plantations. And when we hear the term Native American, we immediately, we are going to remove the idea that these Native Americans were dark complected, because the Native Americans that we see today, or the people who have Native American recognition from the federal government, the usual suspects, they don't look dark. They don't look copper colored. They don't look red. They just look like a bunch of white folks with ponytails. And as one of the interviewees, the head chief of the Yamassee tribe, I believe he's from out of the Yamassee nation out of Carolina. I could be in error. He said most of the people who we are referring to as Native Americans would be identified as Hispanics, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, or Eskimo-looking Asian folk. Now, when you're dealing with so-called Hispanics, all you're dealing with is a mixture of Siberian Asians and European. When I say European, a mixture of Spanish and Asian, a mixture of French and Asian, a mixture of Portuguese and Asian, a mixture of British and Asian. Are you understanding what I'm saying? When I'm saying the term Asian, I'm referring to the individuals who we are taught are the quintessential Native Americans. But history tells us, from archaeological digs, history tells us from pyramid art, history tells us from sculptures of the ancient Americans making of themselves, that there's a group that's not being mentioned when we're talking about the Americas. Am I saying that the people who are classified as Native American, am I saying that they weren't here before the Europeans? No, I'm not. But what the evidence shows us is they were not here before the indigenous, autochthonous, copper-colored, aboriginal, ancient Americans, who today are classified as African American. See, the title of the show is American Aboriginals, Racial Classification Confusion, and the Indigenous Heritage of the Foundation of Black America. What I'm trying to say, what I am saying, is that I am not convinced of the story that I have been sold. Number one, the numbers don't add up. The math ain't right. And if the math is funny, everything else that is surrounded, that is predicated upon the math, has to be questioned. I've made my conclusion based off the research that I have done, and I would recommend, if some of this information is resonating with you and your spirit, I would recommend you talk to some elders in your family. I would recommend that you do your own research. I would recommend that you follow or attempt to look at your genealogy. And 9 times out of 10, if you are classified as black or termed African American in the United States of America, you're going to run into a whole bunch of Native American ancestors. When I'm saying Native American, when I'm saying Indian, when I'm saying American Aboriginal, I'm talking about people who are brown, copper colored. I'm not talking about nobody that looked like an Eskimo with a ponytail. Yeah, I said it. You understand me? See, there's a term that is used that erases your lineage, that erases your heritage. And this is why a lot of the individuals who do this research call it paper genocide. Because after the Dawes Rolls, I believe, of the 1890s and early 1900s, where they systematically renamed folks who have been identified as Indian, they just renamed you as Negro if you were dark skinned. Basically, as Brother Tariq Nasheed says, I'm white, not say so. They had the Indian tint, they had the darky tint, or as the doctor historian said, they had the nigger tint. And you'd have people that knew that they were Native American, if they did get a chance to go and submit their names onto the Dawes Roll, they would be directed into the Negro tent, the nigger tent, the darky tent. Who was holding the census? Who was collecting the census information? People who classified themselves as white and believe in white supremacy. So are we to wholeheartedly accept these classifications as the end all be all?
The point is that the American Aborigines were here and they were here first. The point is that the American Aborigines were here and they were here first. The point is that the American Aborigines were here and they were here first.
So let's break down the hustle. How do you have two groups of people who most for the lack of a better term, were living together, building together? It wasn't always harmonious. And there were conflict, but for the most part, there was infrastructure, there was government, there was civilization, there was trade and barter. There was a little conflict, but that's just it's just nature. There's gonna be conflict here and there. But what the Europeans were able to do, we were able to systematically incentivize one group to assist them in genociding and disenfranchising the other group. You understand me? So you will have the less melanated groups of nomadic Asians that are classified as Native Americans today, who came to the Americas after thousands of years of existence of the Aboriginal ancient Americans, miscegenated, mixed in with, lived amongst ancient Aboriginal Americans, but they were incentivized to dissociate, not only dissociate, they were given Native American classification based upon their willingness to fight against, help kill off, enslave, and separate away from their family members who may have been melanin dominant and or, as the European called them, Negroid, copper colored, brown, black classified. So you have an incentivized breeding out of an incentivized group who is, for all intents and purposes, an umbrella of the global system of white supremacy. They have completely bred themselves out. They show no evidence of color. And not only that, those 5 civilized tribes that took the surnames of the white supremacists, that also accepted the Christianity of the white supremacists, that also accepted the governmental rule of the white supremacists based upon dominating people who were classified as black. Not only that, they practice anti-black white supremacy within their tribes. As you heard about the Chickasaw, as you heard about the Choctaw, as you heard about the Seminoles, as you heard about the Cherokee nations, exiling their foundational black American family members, kicking them out of the tribe so that they cannot receive the land, they can receive the tangibles, the tax exemptions, the funds and resources that come with Native American classification. So you have foundational black Americans who are within these 5 civilized tribes that got kicked out because they're black. And the question is there the same enthusiasm and motivation to kick out the people who are white? And the answer is overwhelmingly no.
Is there a similar effort to disenroll Indians who are white-looking?
No.
The role that the U.S. government, this wasn't willy-nilly cowboys, running wild. This was a U.S. government and its policies that ultimately bastardized, took away from, stole from the Native Americans, made treaties that ultimately were broken. If you want to say willy-nilly, that's where willy-nilly came in. So if you would address that for a moment.
Well, yes, it started at one of the first treaties was the New York Treaty about 1516 that came in. That was one of the first treaties. But in every one of those treaties that they set up with the Indians, they put an inclusion in there saying this, that if you were to cooperate with us and be able to help us maintain the slavery system we set up in this country, and we will reward you and compensate you. We'll give you clothing, we'll give you food, we'll give you weapons, and we'll even call you civilized if you will help us maintain slavery. Every treaty contained a clause to help Indians to shut down black folk. Slavery could never have existed in this country and been maintained without the full participation of the American tribes. That's why they started calling them civilized rock, because they began to say, you quit hunting in the woods and running wild and get yourself some land and get yourself some slaves. So Indians became slave hunters, slave traders, and in the final analysis, all civilized tribes, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians, they all fought with the South to maintain slavery. And so therefore, and they got benefits from it. And that led to, going back to the earlier question you asked me about reparations. And even after the Civil War ended, the Choctaw and Chickasaw were still holding about 12 or 15,000 slaves even after the Civil War ended. The United States government sent in troops saying, you got to get rid of this slavery and set black folk free. And they set up what's called the 1866 Indian treaties with these 5 civilized tribes, which says that black people in this country must not only turn them loose, they must get benefits, they must get forms of reparations, going back to your earlier question. You must first of all set them free. 2, you must give them an option, and this is for all black freedmen and all blacks who lived in the Indian Territory and all black Indians. You must set them free, allow them to have membership in the tribe. You must give them, let them have access to all the resources on the reservation. You must let them also be tax exempt. You must let them have free education. You must also let them be able to give them $150 in cash. You must give them 160 acres of land. And in present day times, those black Indians under the 1866 treaties should be getting, they could also hold gambling casinos. Now, this country has never carried out the full mandates, but yet we are still honoring it for Indians. Right now, all the benefits that Indians are getting in this country are getting it from the 1866 Indian Treaty, because they took up arms against the United States in the Civil War. They killed off, wiped out all previous treaties. Now, every year, In the White House, we get about 560-some white Indian chiefs, which in history they call $5 Indians, because 90% of the people call themselves Indians nowadays are not really Indians. Those are whites passing as Indians because they paid $5 to the Dawes Commission to get their name on the Dawes Rolls so they can get all these advantages. But every year they get invited to the White House. And every year they got an approximate $3.5 billion every year, even that Obama's been in office. They got money into the Federal Indian Bureau. Now see, if you were to talk about reparations, black folks should have been getting all this money all these years too. But they got shut out because the Indians in 1938, they sent a letter to the Department of Bureau of Indian Affairs saying, how do we shut black folk down to make sure they never get any reparations? And that letter floated around in the federal government from about 1938 to about 1941. Then it went to the Secretary for the Department of Interior. And the Department of Interior looked and says, aha. Said, how do I come up with a scheme to shut down blacks so they get no reparations in this country? He said, what you do, you Indians come up with a new concept called a quantum blood law, which says that black folk are not entitled to any of the benefits of the 1866 treaty in terms of reparations unless they can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they got 1/4 Indian blood in them. And we make Indian blood sacred like Jesus Christ's blood. And therefore, they've been shutting blacks out all these years. That's why they didn't get any reparations, to go back to your earlier point. And the last point on reparations, you asked me earlier about a blueprint. This country's always given reparations to all groups except black folk, even though black folk were the ones who built the country. They built the bridges, they picked the cotton, they built the highways, they built the government buildings. They were the backbone of this nation. But now, so in the Marshall Plan, we gave billions of dollars to Germans after World War II. We got under what's called a Point 4 program. We gave reparations to Japanese. We gave reparations to American Indians. We gave reparations to everybody but black folk. Yet black folk are locked into the bottom of a vertical order and a descending order of wealth, owning, and poverty, and control of resources, and nobody wants to address the issue.
Dr. Claud Anderson, straight no chaser, balls. He brings the information with the receipts, relieving and alleviating any confusion about the topic. So in a nutshell, if you re-examine the Civil War, for example, based upon the information that you just received from that presentation of Dr. Claud Anderson, all you had was the nomadic Mongoloid tribes of Asia classified as Native American, armed by the Confederacy in order to maintain the system of white supremacy in the South, along with the business of chattel slavery. And you had the northern white supremacists arming Aboriginal Americans who are arbitrarily classified as Negro and called black. That was the Civil War. Now we have Dr. Sam Richards breaking down the migrations from Asia. Cue the clip.
Okay, everybody, I want you to pair up on this slide. And who's Native American? Just pair up with someone sitting next to you. It's not a trick question, by the way. Only one. What'd you say?
I said B.
B? You said B? What'd you say? C? Yeah? Did you say B? C? You said C? Damn, dude.
I can't really see A that well, but I guess from the other ones, I'd say B.
You'd say B? Okay, well, the answer is A, by the way. The others, did anybody say A? All right, good. So the others are Siberian, so we're going to come to this. All right, let's do the next one. Which one's of Native American ancestry and which one is of Han Chinese ancestry? And the Han ethnic group is the dominant ethnic group in China.
I'm going to say that the one on the right is the Han Chinese ancestry, but I'm not too sure.
The one on the right is Han? What do you say, bro? What did you come to?
Left Native American.
Left Native American?
Right.
Is that what you say? The right is Chinese? Yeah? What's that? The top one is Native American? Okay, so listen. Yeah, it's a real subtle difference, right? Is that what you said?
The top one.
is Chinese.
Top one is Chinese?
Yes.
Dude, killing it. All right, but you're wrong. The top one is Native American. So, all right, go to the next slide. Okay. Asian or European? European or American, bro?
European.
European?
Yeah.
Dude, European or American?
American?
European?
You mean Asian?
I mean, European or Asian?
Asian.
Yeah? Dude, what do you got? Come on, man. The two of you got to have it down. What do you say?
I think he's Asian.
You think he's Asian?
I have no idea.
Yeah? Bro.
I think he's European.
Think he's European? Bro, how about you?
It's definitely European.
Yeah? All right, so here's the deal. You ready? Can you go back to the map? Let me show you something. So, no, the map, the one I think it's like slide 3 or something maybe? Yeah, slide 3. Yeah, okay, so here. Check this out. So here's the map of human migration patterns. So notice how coming out of Asia here and out of China, northern China, so Mongolia up around here, so people migrate this way, okay? We're getting new evidence, by the way, of the migration pattern that people actually came across the channels. It's quite fascinating. Stuff is changing a lot, but here's the idea. Genes come this way. Well, how do genes change? The people that stop here and the people that go here, they're the same. They're not any different, genetically speaking. As you start to come down this way, you start to see very different things. But indigenous peoples of the Americas, right, look a lot like people in this area of the world. But notice, right, how it comes this way. But so Siberian, and 3 of those slides are from, those photos are people right here, and 1 is people right here. So 1 is American, got it? 1 is Asian / but it's really kind of European because they're Russian, because Mongolia and Siberia is part of Russia, and they're really Siberian. And Russia is a European country, and so you could argue that all those folks are European because they're Russian. Got it? You see how, like, the complexity of this? So, but what are they really? And how are they any different? Their DNA is exactly the same. And then we come down here and we have this Native American woman here from this area who looks a lot like somebody from over here that you couldn't really tell the difference because the genes just followed. So I remember I spent a lot of time, I lived in Ecuador for quite a while. I was doing my doctoral research there, and I would spend time in the mountains. I studied this one particular region. It's a province called Azuay in the south central part of Ecuador. And I was going into communities where they had never seen white people in some of the communities. They were indigenous communities, and it was like, except priests who were of European ancestry, but they never had visitors, right? And this is actually a true story. So I spent a lot of time with priests and nuns and, a whole bunch, learned a lot about the Catholic Church, that a lot of times Catholics don't want to know a lot of things that you learn from the inside, but it's all good. And I would go into these communities. Now the priests the Catholicism had sort of conquered them, right? And imposed Christianity on them, the indigenous peoples. And they would show all the images of Jesus. And the images of Jesus are of a white guy with long hair and a beard. And I had long hair and I had a beard at the time. And so I imagine the priests for generations and generations have been saying, Jesucristo está viniendo otra vez. So Jesus is coming again. Jesus is coming. He's coming. He's coming. And in comes this guy on a horseback with the priest with long brown hair and a beard, and people going up to the priest and saying, Padrecito, ¿está él? ¿Es él? It's him? Is that him? Is that Jesus? Like, it's really quite a power trip on my part to have people coming down and bowing at my feet and so on. But that's neither here nor there. But I would be in communities sometimes where I really thought I was in Central Asia, like in the middle of China, because the features, maybe sitting in candlelight or something, and the features of people were exactly the same. I really didn't know. I thought I had been transported. Anyway, the other guy is from Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan is right here. The guy, is he Asian or is he European? And he is Kazakh. So if you know, is anybody Kazakh in here by chance? Anybody? A couple semesters ago, I had someone who is Kazakh. So he is both European and Asian in a way, but he's really European. Kazakhstan is considered to be a European country, so he's European, but he looks Asian. So go figure.
And again, that is Dr. Sam Richards of Penn State University giving an introductory presentation to his class on race and culture. And as you can see, all he was doing is articulating the confusion surrounding racial classification. I hope that I have contributed to less confusion. And remember, keep learning and stay codified.
The point is that the American Aborigines were here, and they were here first.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
If you do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.